I'm Ed Amoroso from Tag Cyber, and I'm here with my good friend Mark Kushnir, who is the Chief Information Security Officer for BroadSoft. How are you doing, Mark?
Hey, pretty good, Ed. How are you?
Welcome to New York.
I'm happy to be here.
Hey, let's talk some security.
Absolutely.
Security and privacy, that interplay. These are two things that traditionally were kind of different. I think there's like a relationship there. Tell me what your thoughts are on kind of that interplay between security and privacy.
I think it's changing. They used to be really two different disciplines. If you looked in most companies, there was a team that ran privacy, and it was mostly a paper exercise about privacy notices. And then there was a team that did security, and their focus was perimeter, malware, things like that. What we're seeing now, certainly in BroadSoft as a global company, is all around the world, except for the United States, which is an interesting thing I'll mention. Everybody is now melding the two together, that they see that obviously privacy requires security, right? Because to keep things private, you have to keep them secure. And in essence, what we're seeing now is that the rest of the world has actually melded the two together in a lot of different ways, either through legislation or through regulations and basically best practices, but it's really turning into a data-centric view in a sense that it's all about the end user data and you must keep it secure. I think that that doesn't discount things like denial of service attacks or malware, but in a company such as ours, we're kind of a unified communication provider. Our customers are counting on us to be the custodians of the end user's data. So it's kind of this trust chain, right? So we sell to service providers who provide our services to end users. And in essence, we basically have to guarantee and have the trust of our service providers that we are actually protecting their data properly. So I think the interesting thing is in the United States, there really isn't a drive towards privacy that I'm seeing around the world from, say, a legislative perspective. I find it very curious that we all give away our privacy without even thinking about it in the United States. And in essence, everything is kind of you're opted in by default. Your data is being collected. It's being shared without your knowledge. And this is something that's changing around the world, and I'm just wondering when the United States will actually catch up with that.
When you say rest of the world, are you thinking mostly a Europe-centric view? Because I don't know about them, like China, Russia, unclear kind of what they think.
It's actually interesting that you look at it. Russia has very strict data policies. In essence, you can't take data out of Russia. So they've actually gotten to the point. And same with China. There's regulations in China under the new China security law, the CSL, that have all these obligations on that data must remain in those countries. You mentioned the EU, and I think the European Union is probably at the forefront of privacy around the world. I would say that they are the gold standard that other countries are looking to. The APAC region is now codifying a whole bunch of data protection obligations that multiple countries are signing up to, Australia, Singapore. And what it means is, the whole point is, since we're in this global world now where data actually moves between countries, each one of these countries, such as the EU as a kind of a union, they want to make sure that if the data leaves the EU, that it's going to be protected in the same fashion it would there. Which and they have big fears about the United States with Snowden and the NSA and things like that. So there's this lack of trust that Americans don't treat data with the same level of obligations that the EU wants. And there's things like Privacy Shield that are in place that companies can sign up to now to ensure that they are living up to the EU standards on these things. But I do find it really interesting that the United States is really behind in that, and any semblance of privacy law has been pretty much thrown away, and even the early moves that were happening under the Obama administration were reversed, under the Trump administration. So I think it's going to be interesting to see if the United States actually does have a turnaround and move in the direction of the rest of the world.
So tell me about GDPR and how it plays in this context.
GDPR is the General Data Protection Regulation that the EU passed. I think it was 2016 or something like that. It comes into effect May 2018, and It's not really, a lot of people say, oh, it's this new thing. It's not really a new thing. What they did was take their old privacy directive. There was a 1995 privacy directive that kind of explained, that explained that users have rights. And part of those rights are transparency on why data is collected, consent on the uses of your data. What GDPR did was actually take that and really dig into it and provide more guidance on what has to happen. And I think more importantly, this general data protection regulation, what it did was put in a fine structure that is pretty onerous if you look at it. A company can be fined up to 20 million euro or 4% of your company's annual turnover, which if you look at that, the reason they put that into place is I think there was a view that a lot of large companies, I won't name them, were kind of not taking privacy seriously, that they'd do things, they'd get caught, and they'd pay the small fine and move on. So this was an attempt to really get into codifying a fine structure. And not only that, but it actually digs in and says it is not only a paper exercise anymore, but you must show that you are actually living up to the privacy requirements. And some of the parts of that is they actually put in articles with respect to data protection. So inside the regulation, Article 32 specifically states that you must adequately protect end users' personal data with appropriate technical and organizational measures, and you must do risk assessments to ensure you have the proper controls in place. You look at that, and it's really the first place I've seen that we talked about that the other day, that there doesn't seem to be anywhere in the United States where anyone says by law you have to do this, right? They talk about you must do PCI, you must do this, but nowhere has anyone just stated just flat out that if you're providing a service, you are required to protect the data. So I think that was actually a very interesting part of it. And it also codified a whole bunch of things you need to do, such as privacy impact assessments, data processing records, meaning you need to actually identify all the data you have, where it goes, where it's stored, why you're collecting it, and what controls you have in place. And there's an expectation you will produce artifacts for this. And it's the same with providing full data mappings where you can actually show the life cycle of data from collection down to destruction and basically have these records. And what we're seeing with our tier 1 European carriers is they're now asking us for these things. They want to see this, and it's actually, I see this as a good thing. I think what it really does is, and again, not to discount malware, botnets, IoT, and DDoS, but for my company, I think if I looked on a heat map, I'd say data exposure, data loss, breach is probably the #1 business threat we have.
Yeah, I would agree. How does that play? Like as you guys design products, do you see these privacy and security concerns becoming embedded into, say, the life cycle design process and kind of build the security and privacy kind of right in? Is that what's happening? And that's probably a good thing if it is happening.
It's not only happening, it is also codified in GDPR. There's another article as part of the regulation that states you must do privacy by design. Now, buzzwords like security by design has been around for a long time, and usually people kind of show that they're doing that by having a software security development life cycle. Right. Doing things like static code analysis, threat modeling. I think privacy by design is not a new concept, but it's kind of new for U.S. companies from a development perspective. And we're actually in the middle of pushing privacy by design down into our development teams. And it's really interesting when you go to developers and you explain how do you actually do security by design and things like that. Very few of them will actually talk about the data, right? They don't start with the data. They start with interfaces. They start encryption. How do I protect the system? And when you get into privacy by design, it literally means that developers, when they add any data element, they have to do multiple things. They really have to first say, why am I collecting this? Is there a reason I need this? And if not, they shouldn't be collecting it. That's really what they call minimization. Only collect what you need. Second of all, if I'm collecting it, how long should I keep it? And this is called like, if I need something to do some processing activity, once that's done, I probably shouldn't be storing it forever, right? So there's a whole concept of retention requirements, which most developers don't even think of. I think most importantly, though, is really doing an impact assessment from a privacy perspective on every piece of data you add, in the sense of saying, this piece of data, what is the harm if it is actually exposed to somebody who shouldn't see it? So what that naturally leads a developer to have to do is, when he adds a piece of data, he should literally sit there and say, who should have access to this data? And those answers should drive what controls should be in place. And at the same time, you should be looking at what is the harm if this data was exposed. For instance, clearly, without even thinking of it, most North American developers would say clearly authenticators, credentials, things like that, we should be encrypting those in databases and things like that. But when you get into it, there's a lot more, say, in our products, because we're dealing with content, right? So we have media content, voice message recordings, IM records. When you start thinking of the harm, what would happen if that's exposed? I think part of it was the educational process also. We went to all the development teams and explained the level of data we have, and as I like calling it, the toxicity of that data. If you look at it, developers never thought that application logs were something that they actually had to protect. And if you look at it, if you go into application logs, you have pretty much everything that would be damaging to any individual. For instance, if you were one of our customers who was, say, in the financial industry, and somebody went through our call log, our application logs, they'd see your full call history in there with the SIP messaging. They'd actually see who you were talking to. So the level of information that are in log files is just amazing, and many companies don't treat that like it's actually part of the crown jewel set of data. So I think that was interesting with the education side of it. So I'd say there was the education side to make the development community aware of what data we have, and that was actually eye-opening for a lot of them. The second part is really pushing down into their early development lifecycle phase, when they're doing kind of their design analysis of truly understanding the purpose of the data they're collecting and who should have access to it and how to protect it. And we were even pushing down things like, we want you to write the usage statements. We want you to say, I'm collecting this data for this purpose. Because it's really what we're certainly with GDPR, it's what's required by us. We need to tell customers a very detailed breakdown of why we're collecting data and for what purpose it is. So I think it's actually a very interesting exercise that was eye-opening to a lot of our developers. I think they're embracing it, though. I think they, as engineers, you tell them something, explain why. Give them a methodology to do it. They just go and do it, right?
Yeah, what an encouraging story. I think that's going to be helpful for a lot of people to hear.
Absolutely.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for sharing your ideas, and appreciate you spending some time with us.
Always a pleasure, Ed.
You bet, Mark.
Thanks.
And we will see you next time.